Hello, my name is Lindsay Belsly, and I am presenting my findings on the survey of the habits of mind in adolescent participants. As far as demographics go, out of my 10 participants, 6 were female and 4 were male. They identified their own main strength out of 4 possible options. 3 of them said academic, 4 said leadership, and 3 said athletic. 0 said artistic was their greatest strength. Out of the 10 participants, 6 said they received mostly A's during school, and 4 received mostly B's, with 0 responding with C's, D's, or F's. 6 out of the 10 participants listed their school as suburban, 2 as urban, and 2 as rural. Out of the 10 participants, 1 is going into 8th grade for the 2019-2020 school year, 5 are going into 9th grade, 1 into 10th grade, 2 into 11th grade, and 1 into 12th grade. And finally, 1 out of the 10 participants is currently 13 years old, 6 are 14, 2 are 16, and 1 is 17. So the results of my survey are shown in this table. The first half are the first 8 survey items: persisting, managing impulsivity, listening to others with understanding and empathy, thinking flexibly, thinking about thinking, striving for accuracy, questioning and problem posing, and applying past knowledge to new situations. The number of responses and percentage of total responses are listed from left to right: strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, and strongly agree. You'll notice persisting has a very high percentage of agreement, with 80% in the agree and 10% in the middle and 10% on strongly agree. Thinking flexibly is the one that I found to be the most central response, with 60% being right in the middle as neither agree nor disagree. However, the other 40% are on the agree side of the scale. And thinking about thinking is the most diverse of all the survey items in the responses, with 10% strongly disagree, 10% disagree, 30% neither agree nor disagree, 30% agree, and 20% strongly agree. The second half of the survey had the following items: thinking and communicating with clarity and precision, gathering data through all senses, creating, imagining, and innovating, responding with wonderment and awe, taking responsible risks, finding humor, thinking interdependently, and remaining open to continuous learning. And the results are shown here with the same scale as the first table. Gathering data through all senses and finding humor also had very high percentage of agreement, with 80% for both of those in the strongly agree category, finding humor having the other 20% in agree, so 100% was on the agree side of the scale. As you can see from both tables, many of the responses for the survey items were on the agree side. There were not very many on the disagree side. For the conclusions that I drew from these responses, one of the big ones was, again, the ones I mentioned that had such a high agreement. So gathering data through all senses and finding humor both had 80% of participants say they strongly agreed that they used those habits of using all their senses to gather data and to find humor in situations. Persisting was also very high on the agreement scale, with 80% on agree rather than strongly agree. So many students left comments that they feel like they are able to power through some adversity to continue on in their studies. I mentioned that thinking about thinking was probably the most diverse survey item in terms of responses. It had 10% strongly disagree, 10% disagree, 30% neither agree nor disagree, 30% agree, and 20% strongly agree. So this was one of the only ones that had responses in all 5 categories, and it's definitely the most spread out of all the responses. So this one was interesting really to look at the comments and see what students were thinking with their different responses because we had such a wide range in responses. And I'll get to some of those comments in the discussion section. Thinking flexibly is the one that I deemed was most central. The responses had 60% right in the middle at neither agree nor disagree, 20% agreeing, and 20% strongly agreeing. This one was another interesting one to look at the comments of thinking flexibly and see why some students chose to be more on the agree side and why a majority of the students chose right in the middle. One thing that I found really interesting was these survey items had at least 90% of the participants respond either agree or strongly agree. So the survey items of persisting, listening to others with understanding and empathy, applying past knowledge to new situations, gathering data through all senses, responding with wonderment and awe, finding humor, and remaining open to continuous learning. And I think that's really interesting because all of these survey items have to do with a student's abilities outside of just academically. So none of these survey items are directly referring to a participant's intelligence or how well they actually do in school. It's all about how they react to situations. Can they go through adversity? Can they rely on things and experiences that they've had in the past? Can they understand someone else and what they're going through? Can they find humor in themselves even if it's when they make a mistake? And I think that's really interesting to find that of all those skills that are not necessarily directly linked to academic achievement, most of the students, 90%, agreed or strongly agreed with those survey items. And I thought that was a really powerful conclusion. And finally, my last conclusion that I thought was interesting is that none of the survey items out of 16, none of them had more than a total of 20% of participants between strongly disagree and disagree. So all of the survey items, at least 80% were either right in the middle or on the agreement side of the scale, which I think is interesting because these students are saying that they agree that they have these skills, and I would argue that most, if not all, of these skills are skills that are necessary to not only be successful in a high school setting, but also just in the real world and in society. And it's important that these students feel like they have those skills before they move on into the real world or even just into high school. As I mentioned at the beginning, a majority of my participants are just coming into 9th grade in this coming year, so they're moving from middle school to high school, which is a big adjustment. And right now, a majority of those students feel like they have these skills that will make them successful in high school in that new environment. As far as the discussion goes, based on all of the participant comments as to why they picked their responses for all the different answers, I came up with some of the most powerful quotes from those comments to discuss some of the common themes I found throughout the survey. On the first survey item, which is persisting through adversity, one of the quotes that stuck out to me is, "I tend to give up easily when things get hard, although I will push through most of the time." And I think for me, the key word there is most, and I think that is why this participant chose agree and not strongly agree, because it's most of the time. If it was every single time and they never gave up, they would have probably picked strongly agree. But I found that many students for this particular survey item mentioned things like they feel like they can persist most of the time, but maybe there's a certain subject that they find harder than others. Maybe there's a certain time of the year where they're busier than others, or maybe they don't have that persistence when things get really tough. They feel like they can persist a majority of the time, but when things get really, really tough, they just can't push through that, and so they choose agree rather than strongly agree. But a majority, as I mentioned earlier, 80% of participants did pick agree for persisting through adversity. One of the other items I discussed earlier, thinking flexibly, which is one of the ones that was most diverse, was the quote, "I do it when absolutely necessary, but I typically look for ways to justify my own side." And this participant chose neither agree nor disagree. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. This was not the one that was most diverse. This is the one that had the largest percentage of neither agree nor disagree, and this was one of those responses. This one really stuck out to me as a science teacher because we focus a lot on coming to a conclusion, getting data and evidence to support that conclusion, and backing that up with reasoning. Why does that evidence prove that your conclusion is correct? And one of the things that I think is really powerful about this comment, and something that I see a lot of times in my students, is that they mention that they're picking a side, they're picking a conclusion first, and then they're trying to justify it by looking for things to justify it. So in the science classroom, I see this a lot. Students will come to a conclusion, they'll make their hypothesis first, and then they'll pick evidence, they'll pick data that will support their side, rather than looking at all the data as a whole and coming to a conclusion after that. And I think that's really powerful because this is something that can really be applied in society. Too many times I feel people have a thought in their mind, and anytime they see a piece of evidence that confirms that thought, they hold on to it. And when they see a piece of evidence that doesn't confirm that thought, they dismiss it, maybe by ignoring it or saying that it's not real evidence, it's not scientific, or other things like that. And I think this particular skill is really important, the thinking flexibly, to be able to come to a conclusion, yes, but be willing to change that conclusion if the necessary evidence comes to light that would have you change your conclusion. And so being flexible, being malleable in your conclusions, and that doesn't necessarily mean giving up what you believe in on someone's snap of the fingers, but being willing to take that evidence in and alter your perspective based on true evidence. And I think that was pretty common. Some of the other comments I saw also referred to kind of being stubborn and thinking in their own way and not really wanting to budge, rather than being willing to change their thoughts and their feelings based on thinking about how other people could be viewing the situation maybe slightly differently. For the survey item of thinking about thinking, this is the one that had the widest variety, the largest spread. And one of the comments here was, "I don't always think about others when I make my decisions, and I tend to only evaluate what I do know." So I think this is important because the question specifically stated that I evaluate what I do and do not know in order to come to a decision. And I think that's an important piece of the skill that a lot of people are missing. They think about what they know to come to a decision, but it's sometimes hard to say, well, wait a second, here's what I don't know, here's what I need to know to learn about in order to understand and make a good decision about this situation. And lastly, this quote came from the survey item of thinking and communicating with clarity and precision. This person chose that they disagree with this statement. I believe they were the only person to disagree with this statement. And their comment was, "I choose this response because I am not a very good public speaker." One thing that I made this stick out in my mind was the full question about thinking and communicating with clarity and precision didn't just mention public speaking or verbal speaking. It also mentioned other ways of communicating. And one common theme that I saw throughout several comments on all the different survey items, and even some of the ones that aren't included on this slide, is that students would tend to focus on one aspect of the question and they would base their response off of that one question. So I feel like for this response, this student read the question, they saw the verbal response, and they thought, I'm not a good speaker, I can't agree with that portion of the question, so that means I'm going to disagree with the whole question, which is interesting. And I wonder if some of these questions were maybe split into multiple smaller questions, if that would change some of these results. So for example, if the thinking and communicating with clarity and precision item was actually split into, say, 3 different questions, one about verbal public speaking, one about nonverbal communication, and maybe one about written or typed communication, I wonder if some of these results would be a little bit different because, again, some of these comments I saw, I could tell that the students were focusing on one specific aspect of the question rather than necessarily looking at the whole question as a whole and thinking of the entire skill as a whole. However, I don't think that really affects my results. I don't think that there's enough of a difference. Something like that question is probably the biggest example I can find of where a skill would necessarily be need to be split into more than one question. I think many of the other skills do encompass the entire skill in the one question, and I think that the results are still valid with that. Overall, I thought this survey was really interesting. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but I did find that many students hold themselves, I feel, to pretty high standards. They feel like they do have these skills, and again, I feel that these 16 skills are skills that are necessary for not only academic success, but also just success in modern day society out in the real world, whether it's college, the workforce, military. They're going to need these skills in order to work through any of the adversities they're going to encounter in life and any situations they're going to encounter. None of these skills are necessarily purely academic as far as academic achievement. So I did find that many of the students, the participants, did hold themselves in high regard. They said that they agreed with most of the survey responses. There were very few responses with even 20% on the disagree or the strongly disagree, and many of them had 10 or 0% on the strongly disagree or the disagree section of the survey. All right, and again, my name is Lindsay Belsly, presenting for the Summer 1 class of SED 512 on the habits of adolescents' minds. Thank you.